Welcome back to the Share Lunch and Learn series. I'm Dan Aldridge, and I have the pleasure today to introduce Jay Venkatesan, who is the President, CEO, and Chairman of Angion Biomedica Corp. For those of you who don't know the company, they're a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company focused on discovery, development, and commercialization of novel small molecule therapeutics to address fibrotic diseases and acute organ injuries. And I probably did not do justice with that at all. And so I'll welcome Jay and kick it over to him to give a little bit of background on the company and explain in more layman's terms exactly what they do. Jay?
Thank you very much. I really appreciate being invited to participate. So Angion has been around for about 20 years, and the work started out of a lab from Dr. Itzhak Goldberg, focused on a pathway that was discovered in part by Dr. Goldberg for acute injury. And acute injury, acute means that it happens suddenly. So a heart attack is an example of an acute organ injury. If you have smoke inhalation and injure your lungs, that's an acute organ injury. If you accidentally ingest a poison and it damages your kidneys or your liver, those are acute injuries. So the company started out focusing on how do we enhance recovery from acute organ injury. And we had a lead program called ANG 3777 that I'll talk about in a moment. Because so many acute injuries lead to chronic damage to those organs and ultimately progressive injury to those organs, the company developed an expertise in fibrosis or scarring of organs and how to slow or prevent that scarring from occurring or from progressing. Fibrosis is the leading cause of death worldwide. Now it occurs in nearly every organ. When people have a heart attack, they get fibrosis and they get scarring in the heart. And so the heart doesn't beat properly and it doesn't pump blood the way it should. When you get scarring in the kidneys, it can't do its filtration function properly and those kidneys start to fail. Cirrhosis of the liver is an advanced example of fibrosis in the liver. And so treating these types of organ scarring and progressive injury is critically important if we're going to have an impact on numerous diseases that can cause fibrosis and lead to progression. So the company had a lead program, ANG 3777, and I'll talk about it a little bit more during the course of this session, but that was addressing acute organ injury directly. And while we had results that I think were encouraging and showed activity for the drug, they were disappointing in that they did not result in the positive trial results we'd expected. So statistically significant with a p-value of 0.05 or less that would have let us file for drug approval. But what I think the market has missed with this company is that we have another program. You said we're a clinical stage company. We're in phase 2. There are 3 phases of testing for drug approval. There's phase 1, which is testing this for safety generally in healthy volunteers. There's phase 2, which is proving that the drug has activity in patients with the condition of interest, and then phase 3, which is the large study that you do in order to prove that for purposes of regulatory review and approval. And so our lead program now is a drug called ANG 3070, which is a small molecule taken by mouth once a day typically, that blocks a number of pathways involved in the progression of fibrosis. And we're studying that currently in a phase 2 study of 2 different forms of kidney fibrosis. They're called FSGS and IgA nephropathy. They're very long names if you go through the whole one. So we won't go into all of that, but suffice it to say, these are 2 forms of kidney disease that can lead to kidney failure. And we're going to be starting in the near future a study in pulmonary fibrosis. We're addressing with our drug very large markets. The pulmonary fibrosis market is about a $4 billion market today. Only about a quarter of patients in the US are treated for pulmonary fibrosis. So that gives you some sense of how large the market opportunity is. And the drugs that are available today are limited in terms of both their efficacy and their tolerability. So patients tend to stop taking these drugs because of side effects. About half of patients go off of drug by the end of a year. So we are focused on trying to address the kidney fibrosis and the lung fibrosis with these phase 2 programs with the goal of, in the near future, meaning next year, 2023, starting clinical trials to go for regulatory approval. And I mentioned the large market for pulmonary fibrosis. The market for kidney fibrosis and for the various kidney diseases is at least as large, if not larger. There are numerous forms of kidney injury, fibrosis that occur. About 30 million Americans have some form of chronic kidney disease. So massive opportunity to impact human life and improve human health if we can impact fibrosis in the kidney. And then the only other point I would make about the company is because of the setbacks we had late last year, the company is trading at what I would describe as at a discount to fair value. I think most companies think they're trading at a discount to fair value, but I can tell you at the end of the year, we had close to 90 million of cash, and today we're trading at about a $50 million market cap. So we're trading at a 30 to 40% discount to cash right now. So the market is not appreciating what we have and the potential that we have. And so I do think that Angion is well positioned over the next 18 months with the programs that we're developing. So I'll pause there. I know I've given you quite a bit to chew on.
Yeah, it's a great overview, and kind of what I'd like to touch on a little bit is what we were talking about before. When you think about the length of time, for a product to come to fruition and get to that clinical testing stage, can you paint the picture for the audience on what does that look like from a timing perspective? From the time that you guys introduce something new to all the different phases to where it actually gets to commercial viability.
Great question. So drug development is a long process, and honestly, you have to be a bit of an optimist to be in this business because a lot of stuff doesn't work. There are a lot of setbacks. The things we don't know about the human body greatly outweigh the things we do know. And so it takes a lot of time and a lot of testing, and you need to be careful because you are testing these things in human beings and you don't want to injure people. So as an example, 3070, we probably have been developing preclinically for 4 or 5 years. We came up with the concept of what we wanted to do, tested it in various cell lines to see whether it would injure the cells, whether it blocked the things it was supposed to block. Then you do a variety of animal models. We've done more than a dozen animal studies in various forms of kidney, lung, intestinal, liver injury, looking at what the drug does. We then go into phase 1. We did phase 1 testing, which is in healthy volunteers. That process takes about 12 to 18 months to get to figure out how high a dose you can go to before patients start having significant side effects. And then towards the end of last year, we started our phase 2 study, the proof of concept study, where we show that the drug has activity in the diseases of interest. That usually takes, call it 18 to 24 months. We expect we'll have data from that phase 2 program sometime in the first half of next year. Following that, we would then do a phase 3 study, which would be another couple of years of development. And that would take us out to call it 2025 or so before we would have those results. And those results would be what would be the basis for regulatory submission to FDA and other regulators around the world. And it takes about a year to go through that regulatory submission process. So the goal would be to get a drug that could be approved in the 26 or 27 timeframe. And so it is a long process. And part of this is the de-risking that you need to do as you go through this, which is the phase 1 tells you this drug doesn't cause significant harm or issues taking the medicine in these healthy patients so that you feel comfortable going into patients for a longer period of time to look for efficacy. And the phase 2 is de-risking in that if you see signs of efficacy and safety, then you can start the larger phase 3, because each stage costs 5 times as much as the prior stage. The phase 1 costs as much as all the preclinical work. The phase 2 costs 5 times as much as the phase 1, and the phase 3 is probably 5 times the cost of the phase 2.
So let's take it up about 10,000 feet a little bit and talk a little about the competitive landscape. So you talked about the market opportunity.
Absolutely.
You guys are in a pretty unique position. Do you have direct competitors?
So great question. So these diseases have multiple approaches that can impact them. As an example, in the kidney diseases we're studying, there are a number of competitors that are developing drugs for FSGS and IgA nephropathy, the 2 forms of kidney injury we're studying. But what I would say is we are unique in that we are the first drug being developed as an antifibrotic, so a drug to address that progressive scarring that occurs. And the way I think of it is, if you think of these diseases as being a 3-legged stool, there are 3 components that cause the injury to the kidney, the progressive injury. The first is that higher blood pressure, so hypertension will cause injury to the filtration parts of the kidney. And so a mainstay of treatment has been trying to control blood pressure with things like ACE inhibitors and ARBs. So drugs that were developed originally for hypertension, but are now used to try to minimize the injury caused by excessive pressures in the kidney. At the same time, a number of these diseases either directly or indirectly have an immune-related component. So the body's immune system causes an attack on the cells in the kidney, either because of mistaken recognition of things in the kidney directly, or because other things are happening in the body and what are called immune complexes, these big combinations of antibodies and dead cells sort of clog up the kidney and then cause this immune deposition. And ultimately the body tries to clear out that mess, but as it's clearing out the mess, it's injuring the kidney. So those are the two legs of the stool that most of our competitors are pursuing. In more recent years, people have also realized that those two things cause fibrosis, and that once the fibrosis occurs, it becomes its own separate self-propagating injury system in the kidney. That once you have fibrosis, fibrosis tends to cause more fibrosis. As an example, our drug targets a receptor, and I won't go into all the detail here, but it targets a receptor called DDR2. And DDR2 is one of those funny things where DDR2 gets activated by the presence of collagen. And people know collagen is a connective tissue throughout your body. But the more collagen you have, the more it activates DDR2. And the more you activate DDR2, the more it causes that organ to put down more collagen. So it's this vicious cycle that as you get this fibrosis, it causes you to get more fibrosis. And so these three separate legs of the stool all cause injury. So we do have competitors, but I think of them less as competitors and more as different approaches that will be used in various combinations and various sequences to address the organ injury. Not that somebody would take one and then say, I would never need Angion's drug. They would say, well, I'm going to take this immune modulator, but maybe it works or maybe it works partly, and they would either add 3070 on or they would progress to 3070. So there are going to be multiple drugs being developed for these indications, but they're more likely to be complementary to rather than competitive with our drug.
Got it. So not necessarily a zero-sum game.
Exactly.
Perfect. So going back a little bit, we were talking about the timing of everything. I imagine COVID was a big impediment, but I'll let you answer the question. But I imagine you were doing the trials, especially on humans and other things like that. Can you talk about a little bit of the delays that came out, any lessons learned, any quote unquote positive impacts that you gleaned from COVID?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there were definitely delays from COVID. The two trials that we were doing for the acute drug 3777, the drug that we had results on last year, one of those studies was in transplantation and kidney transplantation, and the other was in cardiac surgery associated kidney injury. And basically transplantations and heart surgeries dropped to zero for about 3 to 6 months because everyone was focused on COVID, and very quickly they figured out that you don't want patients to get COVID when they're immunocompromised and getting a transplant. The few transplants that got done before COVID became rampant. The patients who got COVID, at one of the hospitals we were studying, we were doing our trial at, they called us and they said, we've got to stop because every patient who gets COVID who's gotten a transplant has died. And so they stopped doing transplants for a number of months. So that was a big setback in terms of the timing that we had. But the positive things, and you always are looking for silver lining. COVID doesn't have lots of silver linings, but one of the silver linings, and I think it's true for us and for many other companies, is that we really rethought how we're doing our work. And because we didn't know when we'd be going back to the office, we ended up taking a much more global and virtual approach to people being in the office, which allowed us to hire people all over the country. Instead of saying, well, you live in Indiana or you live in Michigan and we need you to move to our Boston location, which is more expensive and so on, we decided we were going to let people work from home or work remotely. And we put in place a lot of processes and procedures to make that happen. And frankly, I think that has allowed us to hire better quality people, because it's hard to convince somebody to move to a very high cost of living like San Francisco or Boston if they're living in another city. Plus they have personal and professional ties locally. So the idea that we could do things remotely and allow people to do that has, I think, actually worked out really well for us and has positioned us to run this phase 2 trial, which is being done on a global basis, in a much more productive way. We're much better at sort of managing these remote processes, interacting with clinical trial sites through Zoom meetings, through virtual site initiation visits. And that, I think, has been a huge benefit for us in the long run.
Okay, so going back a little bit to the ANG 3777 that we talked about before, obviously you had some disappointing results from that. Just from my understanding, is that program stopped? Is there anything else to do there? What are the possibilities of seeing any benefits from that?
So great questions. It was viewed by the market and by us as disappointing results. I think the market just looks at, hey, it was either positive or negative. There's not a lot of nuance. When we looked at this, we said there's clearly some signal here. The drug is doing something. The endpoints in the trial were better on drug than placebo on virtually every endpoint. Now, not as good as we had hoped, and as you create a trial design and you put a number of patients in with the idea that you will be able to show statistically a difference between the two arms. And on some endpoints, we showed that difference, and on some we did not. But as we dug into this and looked at things like biomarkers, so chemical signals in the blood, evidence of organ injury, other things that would tell us, does the drug work or not? What we saw is that there's pretty clear evidence that the drug does something, that it's active, that it is not simply giving the patient a placebo. Now, is it good enough to file for regulatory approval or to start a phase 3? No, not at the moment. But we've been working with our partner Vifor Pharma, which is a global leader in the nephrology space, going through the data in detail to figure out, is this an issue of the dose we were using, the duration of therapy? Would we have been better off with twice a day versus once a day dosing? So we're doing that work with Vifor and analyzing the data with Vifor to decide whether there's something to go forward with. What we have said pretty clearly to our investors has been, if we go forward, it will be on revised terms with either Vifor or another partner in other indications, that where they would take on more of the development costs, because we just don't have the resources to both fully commit to 3070, which we've done, and do a full new clinical program in 3777. So what I would tell people is that I don't think 3777 is completely dead, but we would make sure that it was externally funded in a non-dilutive way before we would push it forward on our own.
Makes complete sense. And so talk a little bit about funding. And so let's talk about cash a little bit. You mentioned it before. You have a pretty healthy cash balance. Obviously one of the concerns people have, right, is how long will that last, right? And kind of what does the future look like? What is your kind of anticipation, for cash burn as you go forward? And then should you need it, what kind of avenues are there for more capital?
Great question. So at the end of the year, at the end of 21, we had about 88.8 million in cash. What we have said publicly is that cash will take us into late 2023, assuming no other changes, meaning no fundraising, no partnering. But that will get us through quite a few different important value creating catalysts. That would get us through the readout of this very important phase 2 trial in kidney disease. It would let us have data from pulmonary fibrosis in humans. It would let us advance the pipeline that we have and bring potentially another drug into clinical trials. So we would have a pretty robust set of results between now and the end of 23. But we do have a number of avenues to raise money. Obviously, there's always equity, but at these stock prices, we'd be pretty unhappy about raising equity when we're trading below cash. But there are a number of things. There are royalty buyers. So if we think that there's value to these drugs, and the companies out there that buy royalty streams believe that as well, they would buy a stream of future royalties off of, say, 3070 in exchange for upfront cash. There are a variety of basically venture debt type lenders who see that there's a lot of value here. and would loan us money. And then most importantly, our business development opportunities, so licensing opportunities. Between 3777, which we still have that partnership with Vifor for the kidney, but we own and retain the rights outside of the kidney. 3070, we retain global rights to that drug. We have 3 different drugs in our preclinical development, and all of those are potential candidates for partnering or out licensing, where a large pharma or large biotech company would give us meaningful money upfront or development support or both in order to have rights to those drugs. And that would extend our runway, I think, pretty significantly. Our burn is not so high that if if you look at comparable drugs in comparable states, I am not telling you this is what we will get, but if we did a $50 million upfront deal for Asia Pacific on, say, 3070, that would buy us another year worth of runway, and that would be well within what is reasonable, or even on the low end of sort of upfront money from a phase 2 drug. So we do think that there are a lot of different ways we have to extend our runway beyond the end of 23 without necessarily having to go back to the equity markets. And our goal is, if we go back to the equity markets, it would be because we have achieved successes and the stock price is at a much higher value where we feel comfortable going out and raising more money.
Yeah, you go back on your terms for sure.
Yes, exactly.
So another one, just to talk about, you mentioned it, is the other products, the other drugs. So we talked a lot about 777 and 3070. What else is in clinical stage that you're excited about, that you can talk about today?
So we don't have, those are the 2 that are in the clinic, so in humans today, but we do have 2 drugs that are in late stage preclinical development. So doing the animal work, doing the other work. One of them is targeting something called ROCK2. And ROCK2 is an interesting target because there was a company, Cadmon Pharmaceuticals, that had a ROCK2 inhibitor. They were recently acquired by Sanofi for $1.9 billion on the basis of that one program. And we think our ROCK2 inhibitor has best-in-class characteristics in terms of selectivity. So how well does it target that particular target and not hit other targets? We think it's the most potent, so it hits it with very small quantities of drug. You can inhibit ROCK2. And that's really important because ROCK2 is associated with fibrosis. It's also associated with a condition known as pulmonary hypertension, which is a multi-billion-dollar market, where the vasculature in people's lungs is too tight, and so they get clogging in the lungs, and it ultimately leads to lung problems and heart problems. It's a huge opportunity and remains an unmet medical need, even though there are some therapies out there. So we think ROCK2 is a pretty exciting target. We've gotten a lot of inbound interest from partners on that, asking when we're going to be discussing, when we would be interested in having partnering discussions. And our answer there is, once we've selected a clinical candidate. So we have a number of drugs that we are testing right now, that we're synthesizing. We run the tests with the idea that once you pick a clinical candidate, that's the drug that you now do all of your toxicology and other testing so that you can get it into humans. And our goal would be to select a clinical candidate for that or the other program, which I'll describe, which is CYP11B2, by the end of this year. We want at least 1 and maybe 2 clinical candidates from those 2 programs selected. CYP11B2 is something called aldosterone synthase. That's part of this system. Every part of this system has been drugged except for CYP11B2. So this is called the RAS pathway, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway. There are drugs that block the receptor. There's ACE inhibitors and ARBs, which were at one point the largest class of antihypertensives in the world. But nobody's been able to block the production of aldosterone at CYP11B2. There are now a couple of companies in the clinic with CYP11B2 inhibitors. And we think our CYP11B2 inhibitor has, again, best-in-class characteristics. So we're in the process of doing the work to refine the molecule and select a clinical candidate with the idea that we would either partner that or take it into clinical testing, hopefully in 2023.
Very fascinating. So we're coming up on the bottom of the hour. Before I turn it back over to you for some closing thoughts, would just like to get your thoughts on, look, if there's an investor that's watching this today that's new to the company, new to the stock, what's your value pitch to them, and why should they invest in Angion longer term?
Thank you. So what I would say is we're trading below cash with what I think is really exciting science and what is most importantly, a well-trod path ahead of us. So our drug 3070 is targeting many of the same things that a very established drug known as OFEV or nintedanib is targeting in pulmonary fibrosis. And that drug does about $3 billion a year in revenue and has been growing 30% a year for the past couple of years. It's a huge market. As I mentioned, only about a quarter of patients in the US are currently treated. So if you think about the $4 billion addressable opportunity for pulmonary fibrosis, that's probably about 2 to 3 times larger if you could actually get more patients on therapy. A lot of patients aren't on therapy because of side effects. So what I would say is it's a relatively de-risked asset. We are going after targets that have been established as being relevant in the diseases we're going after. So in the kidney and the lungs. The class of drugs that we are in, the kinase inhibitor, tyrosine kinase inhibitor class of drugs, there are, I think, 17 approved tyrosine kinase inhibitors today. It's a class of drugs that we know is druggable, works in humans, causes changes in disease, progression in cancer and in fibrosis and so on. So I think it's a relatively de-risked story. And I think the opportunity is that so many people were focused on our first drug, the acute organ injury drug 3777, that they have never really looked to see what 3070 was. And I do think that it is a huge market opportunity where we think we have a potential best-in-class drug in 2 very large indications. And we're going to have data from clinical trials confirming the activity in those diseases in the next 12 plus months. And that's, I think, pretty exciting stuff for a biotech company trading, with a margin of safety because of the discount to cash.
Perfect. So that's a great way to end it. And so Jay, I appreciate the time. Super fascinating. Look forward to having you guys on again to track the progress of the company, and see where 777 gets. With that, I'd like to thank everybody for joining the Lunch and Learn series today. We're going to have a short transition, and then up next is financial services company WisdomTree. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Really appreciate you having me on today. Take care.
Thanks, Jay.